Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Keith Darden, who's a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. Welcome to Background Briefing, Keith Darden.
Thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to join you again.
Well, thanks for joining us, Keith. And resisting occupation that's the story of the moment, isn't it? How the incredible resistance that the Ukrainians are putting up, particularly when they were so ill-equipped compared to the Russians, so outnumbered and outmatched with military equipment. And, obviously the US should have done, and NATO should have done, and could have done a lot more to help them in terms of arming themselves and to defend their country. But our leaders and NATO's leaders, obviously it operates on consensus, and particularly the EU, didn't want to upset Putin, and look where we have now. So is this whole situation in Ukraine entirely dependent upon the bravery of the Ukrainians? I mean, they are fundamentally fighting for democracy, and here at home we are having our democracy slip through our fingers. So I think it's pretty shameful what's happening here compared to what the Ukrainians are standing up for.
It's partly dependent on the resilience of the Ukrainians and their willingness to fight, which seems to be quite substantial. But it also depends somewhat on the Russians and their willingness to fight, which seems somewhat less substantial, to be perfectly honest. I think a lot of elites in Moscow, even at the upper echelons of the administration, were pretty shocked by this decision. Did not agree with this decision. And if it ends up being something where it's actually quite punishing for Ukraine, that popularity is going to diminish even further in Russia. And so there were actually reports of Russian soldiers really not fighting in earnest. So personnel not leaving their APCs, their armored personnel carriers, to engage in direct battle. These are two countries that have a lot of close ties. This is not a kind of Serb versus Croat kind of hatred like we saw in the Balkans. And I'm not sure that the Russians' heart is really in it. Putin's heart is in it, but Putin's not on the battlefield.
So could it backfire on him? I mean, I was just speaking earlier on the program with Colonel Vindman, and he's concerned that reports that Zelensky's going to meet with Russians on the negotiators on the Belarus border. And he said, there's still an outside chance that the Russians could kill and capture him. That would be pretty extreme, but the fact that if you take the negotiating offers at their face value, that means, I guess, that Putin's realizing that it's not going so well? I mean, does he recognize the backlash that's happening, not just against his money and his cronies' money, but what you just told us about military morale? He sent in his B team, the younger conscripts, and he's holding back his A team. About 50% at least of his military haven't gone into Ukraine yet. But Colonel Vindman said he suffered some serious casualties, particularly amongst the Spetsnaz, the special forces. They've suffered huge casualties. And
yes.
That's got to be getting at least the military's attention. I don't know whether it's getting Putin's attention.
Yes. There are reports, I don't know whether Colonel Vindman mentioned this, but there are reports that there's pushback among the Spetsnaz leadership, that they may have been given the order to take Kiev by Monday, and that they recognize that that type of urban warfare would be extremely costly to their highly trained forces, and that that's just not something that they're really ready to do. So, I think partly we're seeing negotiations now, and I do think they're honest and in earnest. I think it would be shocking and unlikely if Zelensky were simply struck at the border when he was invited for negotiations. And you would certainly have another leader of Ukraine emerge. So killing Zelensky does not solve the Russians' problem in this case. I think part of the problem is that the war is going poorly for the Ukrainians and the Russians. So within 72 hours of the onset of the conflict, you have Russian forces fighting inside the city limits of Kiev, the capital city. And Kiev is the most defended fortress in all of Ukraine. So there's reason on the Ukrainian side to seek a settlement in a war that they seem to have thought that they could avoid. So I think there was a little bit of surprise on the Ukrainian side that Russia actually pulled a full-scale invasion. But yes, on the Russian side, it's not going as well as their optimistic scenarios would have hoped. And so, now we're reaching that moment where the optimism on both sides that we saw in January, both the Russians thinking that, Ukraine would fold just like Afghanistan and you'd see defection of troops and cities, and it would crumble within days. And on the Ukrainian side, the sense that Russia wouldn't dare actually invade, so that they didn't have to pursue some kind of unfavorable settlement to themselves in advance. That optimism is now crushed. And so now there may be some kind of deal space. In other words, some kind of agreement that could be reached that would give the Russians a way out and preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. So I think that's truly on the table. Yeah.
And again, I'm speaking with Keith Darden, a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. Well, it's pretty obvious that not only did the West and NATO make a mistake in not arming the Ukrainians better so they could defend themselves, because they didn't want to upset Putin. And all along, it's pretty clear that Putin wanted to crush Ukraine and turn it into a kind of pet like Belarus has become. But on the other side, of course, Zelensky, he mustn't have been listening to Biden, because Biden laid it all out. Everything that Biden told the American people in the world, what Putin was up to, turned out to be absolutely accurate. And presumably they kept telling Zelensky that the Russians are going to attack you and they're going to take Kiev, and Zelensky seemed to be more concerned about not sowing panic as opposed to preparing the defenses. And of course, by putting most of their forces up against the Russians in the east on the line of control in the Donbass, they were less prepared to defend Kiev and Kharkiv. But still, at this point, it's extraordinary how the Ukrainians have managed to do as much defense as they've been able to muster. It's pretty impressive. And again, it just feels to me like we should take this lesson that how people are fighting so hard for democracy. They've had democracy and the rule of law, which the Russians don't have. I mean, their association with democracy is chaos and economic collapse. But the Ukrainians have had it, they want it, and they're fighting for it. And again, here at home, we're watching Trump's GOP conduct so much voter suppression and vote rigging that they could steal the next two elections. And as far as I can tell, half the country's asleep, or maybe more of it's asleep, not recognizing how frail our own democracy is at home. I may be a little off topic here.
Well, I think we have to be careful in reading back into the past what could have been done differently, because Russia did invade. And partly they invaded because of military cooperation between Ukraine and the West. So it's highly likely that if our military engagement with Ukraine had been stepped up a notch earlier, we would have seen a Russian invasion earlier. So I think the Russians actually were willing to avoid this invasion, but they would have accepted only the implementation of the Minsk agreement, Minsk II, which was, ratified in a UN Security Council resolution. There are reasons to think that Minsk, which the Ukrainians found to be unacceptable, and Washington never really encouraged the implementation of either, that if that agreement had been put into place, which would have meant changing the Ukrainian constitution, essentially giving each region of Ukraine a veto over Ukrainian foreign policy orientation, that would have been acceptable to the Russians, right? That this would have been a kind of appeasement that might have worked. I think that if we had really ramped up our military engagement with Ukraine earlier, I just think we would have seen a Russian invasion in 2016, 2017, along the lines of what we're seeing today. And in fact, the Ukrainians would have been far less prepared to resist then than they are now. They have actually invested a great deal of their own resources in their military. Right now, much of their air defense system, for example, is of their own production and their own design. And so Ukraine is no slouch in military affairs. The problem is that, Russia is much more substantial. Ukrainian forces are not particularly mobile. So even if Zelensky, for example, had wanted to relocate on short notice some of the units, the elite units that are currently in the Donbass, they're not very mobile, those units. And so they're kind of dug in. It's kind of France versus Germany, on the eve of the Second World War. The Ukrainians kind of have a Maginot Line right there on the Donbass. And the Russians have, the specialty of the Russian military is mobile armor. And so they are able to concentrate their forces on virtually any border of Ukraine. But Ukraine is not able to move its forces to any border of Ukraine, which makes their situation particularly difficult. And once it became clear that Russia had made the decision to invade, we've been pouring weapons into Ukraine in a way that would allow them to counteract that Russian armor, reduce its mobility, and reduce its effectiveness for as long as possible.
So if Ukraine had taken Minsk II, which was politically suicidal for any Ukrainian leader because it would give Russia veto power and essentially they'd achieve politically what they're now trying to achieve militarily, which is to neuter this country. So at this point in these negotiations, what does Ukraine have to give up? And, what will Putin accept? Obviously, he's not going to necessarily end up with what he calls a demilitarized and denazified country. So what kind of outcome if these talks go ahead in earnest?
Yeah, and I just want to say that the language of denazification is not just ridiculous, but just offensive in this case, particularly since Zelensky's own family is Jewish, and he fought, his family fought the Nazis all the way back to Berlin. So, and that's clearly that framing of the Ukrainian government is one of the more ridiculous aspects of Russian propaganda. But I would say that Minsk II is not the same thing as what would result from a Russian invasion. A Russian invasion is going to be complete regime change in Kiev, probably, the imprisonment or murder of every member of every government of Ukraine post 2014, right? It's going to lead to a radical purge at all levels of society of more pro-Ukrainian, sort of non-Belarusian style elites. And it's going to lead to a very repressive regime for a significant period of time. That's not what Minsk would have done. Minsk would have not necessarily neutered Ukraine, but it would have neutralized Ukraine so that, under Minsk, Lviv, right, the western parts of Ukraine, which are very pro-NATO and anti-Russian, would also have had a veto over Ukrainian foreign policy. So the Ukraine that will result from a successful Russian invasion is going to look a lot more like Belarus on steroids, whereas Minsk had a risk of looking a little bit more like Bosnia in the sense of almost a confederalized, very fragmented Ukraine that could not have formed an alliance with NATO, but also could not have essentially been a platform for Russia in the way that the Belarusians have become. So and I think that what could be achieved in these negotiations is something like a neutral Ukraine, but a neutral Ukraine that has no risk, essentially, of being directly controlled from Moscow. And so that might be a good outcome for us, as opposed to meaning the West and those advocates of democracy, because, I personally, don't want to see democracy snuffed out in Ukraine. And I think that Russia has the military capability not only to snuff out democracy, but to snuff out a lot of the Ukrainians that I care about. And so if that could be avoided by some sort of settlement now, I think that's certainly worth a chance. And it is conceivable. Again, all the diplomacy on this has been a kind of narrow window. But sometimes force and the use of force creates clarity on both sides that allows for a realism that allows a diplomatic process to move forward.
Well, Keith Darden, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Keith Darden, who's a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. And his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking at a dissent amongst Russia's elites and how the Tsar and the Kremlin's brutal miscalculation could be the beginning of the end.